Someday I will do a topographical study of exactly how the talit can always turn itself upside down. I'm not quite sure of the geometry of it all. Just a little bit of levity because unfortunately I don't have a joke for the start of the actual sermon. War is a mitzvah. It may be surprising. Most people think of mitzvah as being something like a Boy Scout oath of being kind to old ladies crossing the street. And they don't imagine that war falls into that category. But Judaism actually has a very old and very well-established understanding of war. Partly because we have often been the victim of it, but also partly because we have often had to be an active participant in war. Now, when I say war is a mitzvah, I have to be very clear. Some wars are a mitzvah. We are not a jingoistic people by nature or by faith. We are not one of the barbarians that believe that only in war can a person find personal satisfaction. We are not one of the robbers who believe that if I have the might, I have the right to kill you and take what is yours. And we are not one of those who believe that the Ubermensch is only revealed through the glorious struggle over others. But we know that sometimes war is a mitzvah. In fact, there are 3 categories of war that are mitzvot, that are commanded, where we do not get a pass. We do not get a chance to say, no thanks. The first is the past, the conquest of the land of Israel, the return from Egypt, the settling of the land. If those who were there refused to accept terms of peace, refused to allow us to return to our home, then we were commanded to make war upon them. That time is past. Those inhabitants are gone, and thus there is no commandment that is still in the modern world to wage war for that reason. Part 3 is the end, which is to say, the end of days, the battle between good and evil in the final days of Mashiach. Yes, there will be a war among those that are following the teachings of righteousness, which will come from across the world, against those holdouts, which are more like the first categories I was mentioning, of people who still want evil because they have decided evil is what is right. And there will be a war, and when that war comes, we will be commanded to fight upon the side of good. Which leaves really actually only one category of war left where we are commanded to wage war. And that is a war of self-defense. If we are attacked, we don't get to say, I'm going to sit this one out, you go fight. In fact, all of the laws of who is excused from the battlefield in Jewish law are canceled when it comes to wars of self-defense. The bridegroom returning back to his chuppah, the person who just planted a vineyard, the person who just built a house, if it is a war of self-defense, they go to the front lines along with everyone else. But hopefully that's also making you scratch your head and say, wait a minute, Rabbi. If they go back when it's a war of self-defense, and if the wars of conquest and the wars of the end of days are all within that same category, then in what wars do they get excused? Are there other wars? Yes. There is a melchemet mitzvah, a war that is commanded, of the type I just described, and there is a melchemet reshut. It may shock you to know that there are optional wars in Judaism. There are wars that the king can call if the king wants to call them. A little surprising? No. Not certainly in the ancient world. In fact, there's a story in the Talmud about this which lays out the process very, very clearly and I think very, very powerfully. David is king, and the advisors of the kingdom come to him and say, Melech David, King David, the people need more. The people are impoverished. The people lack the wherewithal to live. They need more. David's first response is, well, one should help the other and the other should help the first. Basically, just, work it out. It's okay. To which the advisors point out very adroitly, you can't fill a hole with the dirt you dug out of it. It's an idiom for basically meaning you can't just have a closed system and expect there to be growth. People can't just swap around the same dirt. And if you've ever actually planted anything, you'll know when you dig the hole and then you refill it, it always looks like some of the dirt disappeared because you've compacted it in the refilling. But this is the idiom. So David says, all right, fine, so we'll wage war. Some of our neighbors have a lot. We can attack them, conquer them, and take it. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Maybe painfully familiar. As Harry Ryan was just saying, how many families had to flee in the 1930s and then 40s as a nation decided it needed more room, needed more space, needed more wealth, needed to secure the natural resources. Not only in Europe, but across South Asia as well, empires rose because they needed more for their people. And it was only reasonable and responsible. Was Judaism then just a inept empire? Did we have no other rules to govern when we would attack another? Were we just one of the countless empires throughout history? Only we were small and not as successful and thus didn't get on the map like Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, or Genghis Khan. Well, no, says the Talmud. Because just because you think war is a good idea doesn't mean you get to go ahead and do it. Once the decision has been made to explore the war option of helping the nation in an optional war, this Melchemet Reshut, the king has to go and visit 3 different people. It's like one of those old-time fairy tales. The king first goes and visits the general, the guy who actually is in charge of the troops, and asks him, could we go to war? Is this a good idea? Would we get completely destroyed? Do we have the soldiers? Do we have the equipment? Do we have the logistics? Are we prepared for war? You don't get to go to war just because you want more. You have to actually do it correctly if you are going to do it. Because if not, you are causing meaningless slaughter for not only your enemies, but also for your own people. The king does not get to order his people off into the charnel house of war simply because he thinks it might help the economy or, as often happens, help his own popularity or secure his position within the government. The king is only allowed to send the war if the general signs off on it and says, yes, we are capable, we are prepared, and we have a very good chance of winning and securing the goals that you are setting out for yourself. Now, that would be where most of the empire stopped. Genghis Khan didn't ask any more questions. Are we able to attack this country? Yes. Do they have something we want? Yes. Perfect. Everything is answered. Let's go kick down the door and take what we want. But Judaism says you got 2 more stops to make. You have to go to the Sanhedrin. You have to go to the rabbinic court. You go to the rabbinic court and you ask them, is this just? Is this right? Is this fair? Is it good? Is this the correct course of action? Not, will it be financially beneficial? Not, will we be able to win and come home covered in glory? But is this correct? Sometimes, most of our history, Israel was surrounded by despotic, idolatrous nations that attacked us at every turn. And often we're still sending cross-border raids even during times of what might be called peace. Certainly under those circumstances, the Sanhedrin would often say, well, we're not in an active state of war with them at the moment, but these people are fairly horrible. And yes, we might be in a position where we can not only help ourselves, but maybe even help some of the people under their rule. Under these circumstances, it might be okay. The Sanhedrin was a moral check to find out whether or not the decision to go to war was ethical, in addition to being practical. And if the Sanhedrin checked off, the king gets the next stamp in his little book, he goes on to his final stop, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And he has to talk to the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Well, I say talk to the high priest, he's not actually talking to the high priest. He has to inquire of God. He goes to the high priest who has what are called the Urim and Tumim. You may have noticed them somewhere in our many, many chapters of descriptions of the building of the Mishkan. These were two little stones that were inside the folded breastpiece of the Kohen Gadol, and they were considered oracles. They were considered to have the capacity to somehow, and there is much commentary about this, somehow to indicate God's will on different questions. Think of it, if you will, like an approved Ouija board. At least that's the way some commentators describe it. And the king had to ask the Kohen Gadol, what does God say? Yea or nay? And having consulted with the Urim and Tumim, the Kohen Gadol would then give an answer. And if the general had said yes, and if the Sanhedrin had said yes, and God says no, you stand down. There needed to be divine approval before the king went to war for anything other than those three categories I mentioned at the beginning. Even with everyone else in society on board, if God said, you may have convinced yourself that it is practical, you may have convinced yourself that it is ethical, but it is not, stay home. You stay home. So now, 2022. What is the option for going to war? Test time. You are president of country A, and you are, I hope, following Jewish law. When can you go to war? Under what circumstances? Let's see how well you've been paying attention. Self-defense. Okay, self-defense, absolutely, unless Mashiach shows up, in which case, that's fine, we can sign on. But pretty much, as things stand at the moment, self-defense. I will point out that Judaism has long understood that there are occasional needs for what might be called a preemptive strike as far as self-defense goes. It's not entirely you have to wait until the enemy is at your gates, but self-defense must be the cornerstone. Nothing else? What about this Milchemet Rashut? What about the permitted war, the optional war? No, there are other optional wars. When David goes across to attack others? 2022. Why can't we have optional wars?
We can, but in this case, we have a country.
Now, before we get to the country and everything that's going on with Ukraine, why can we not have an optional war? We cannot consult with God through the high priest. There is no Urim and Tumim. Remember how I mentioned at the beginning of the Torah reading that it may feel a little pointless that we build all of this stuff through all of these Torah readings and now it's all gone? Well, one of the things that's gone is the Urim and Tumim. We have no consultation with God that can tell us, yes, you are now authorized to go and attack those who are not attacking you and shed their blood. And by doing so, you will not be called a murderer. Only God can give us that dispensation. Only God can say, cross that border and kill that person who has done nothing wrong to you, and it is not murder. And without God's statement, it's murder. It's terror. Yes, Bernie?
So would the statement be correct to a person, or would the statement be made to the people in general? There are plenty of people who say that they have a connection directly with God, and they're the ones that know what he's saying, knows what he's thinking. And we say they're a little off kilter. until they gain weapons, and when they gain weapons, then we seem to block them out.
So would this be a response that was given publicly? You know, sort of standing before the giant yes-no scoreboard and God makes one side or the other lie up? Or was this a private conversation with God and the Kohen Gadol could just make up any old thing and, you know, God forbid he would, but we know that not every Kohen was always righteous. The short answer is that the rabbis understood that the Urim and Tumim was considered to be a semi-public act. That this was not done only in the Holy of Holies, privately away from any other eyes, but it was something that was a miraculous exposure of God's will that was understandable to more than just the Kohen Gadol. And indeed, it is precisely because we are given this very particular version of how we will ascertain God's will in this most crucial of matters that we cannot accept any substitutes. We can't say, well, we don't have the Urim and Tumim, but tell you what I'll do. I'm going to go roll dice. And if I get double sixes, that means God wants me to invade. No, that is not what the Torah said we do. That is not what our tradition says we do. We don't get to fill in other oracles as we wish to ascertain God's will. God told us what he would want. God took it away from us in the destruction. God does not want us to look for random signs, omens, and oracles to decide when attacking someone who has done us no wrong counts as murder and when it doesn't. Because it always counts as murder unless it is self-defense. Until the Mashiach arrives, at which point things will be indisputably clear who and what that stands for, and that's a whole nother conversation. We have no choice but to recognize that war can only be fought for self-defense, and any war fought for any other reason is murder. And we do not stand by while someone is being murdered. We don't. That's another commandment I'm afraid to tell you. We don't stand by while someone is being murdered. By recognizing that there is no justification for war except self-defense, we are painted into an ethical corner. We are locked into the inevitable logic of the mitzvot. If it is not a justifiable war, then it is murder. And if it is murder, God has told us we must stand against those who commit murder. Now, sometimes we lack the ability to go out and stop the murderer directly. Sometimes we have only the capacity to bring them to justice. Sometimes we cannot help the person that is being murdered, but we can help the family of the one that has been killed. But we must each seek out the way that we can respond to this horrific situation. Those who came after World War II looked back with shocked indignation. How could the world allow a madman to invade not only Austria and Czechoslovakia, but Poland and France and Russia? And how could they not help those who were escaping under the terror that was being perpetrated? Our country certainly failed at that time. Tens of thousands of Jews tried to leave and come to the United States. And due to the racist and anti-Semitic policies of immigration at that time, they were turned away. Some were able to find other countries of refuge. Most ended up back under the Third Reich. Most were murdered. And then those who looked with indignation when their own troubles and tribulations came in the later generations and later successive conflicts, when people would be fleeing from Korea, from Vietnam, people fleeing from Afghanistan, people fleeing from the wars of Syria, again and again and again, well, I'm not sure we want to get involved. Some of those people running may be bad. Maybe this will cause too much trouble politically, geopolitically. We don't want to make allies. We don't want to antagonize. And besides, where would they go? Do we want them here? Do we really want refugees? I'm not sure. At least that has been the line over and over again. Now, I can't tell you you have to open up your door to a Ukrainian refugee, and God willing, Ukraine will be able to withstand what is happening and be able to avoid a catastrophic collapse. But I don't know. I am not a prophet, and I do not have the Urim and Tumim, and I don't know what's in store for them. And I shudder to think about what it must be like to be celebrating Shabbat under these circumstances. But I can tell you there are things that you can do. I mentioned earlier the Masorti movement and its incredible program put together on Thursday. It was not just to have a prayer, it was also to remind us of the Masorti communities that are in the Ukraine, the Jewish synagogues that are part of the conservative movement, and to show us the members of those communities through Zoom, to hear from them, to recognize the Masorti movement is funneling aid to those communities to help them to be secure where they are or to get out if necessary for the time being. Numerous other aid organizations are doing the same. And we have an obligation to help. Pick your favorite, whatever it might be. And then we have the other side as well. In addition to helping the Ukrainians in whichever material way we can, in addition to our spiritual assistance, we must be sure to not give any aid to those that are murderers. Russia needs to be ostracized. Russia needs to be cut out and made a pariah nation every bit as much as North Korea. Talk to your families, organize boycotts, address political leaders and say, enough is enough. If this is allowed to stand, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania will be next. Poland will be next. Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, France. There will be no end. There was no end in sight when the appeasement of Adolf Hitler was first entertained. Allowing the amalgamation of Austria, sure, of course, all the Austrians wanted that. One of the great lies of history. Allowing them to take the Sudetenland, well, this will surely be enough. It is never enough. For those who see war as not being a question of, is it practical, is it ethical, and is it divinely sanctioned, but only will it get me what I want, it is never enough. Which means the only way to convince them not to go to war is to convince them that it is not worth it. And since we risk nuclear war, we obviously cannot simply throw American troops onto the field and convince them through bloody battle that it is not worth it. So all that is left is to convince them that if this is the way they wish to behave, they will be removed from polite international society. They are already being cut out of sporting events, of cultural events, and that's a great start. But ultimately, economics is the only lever that we have. When people talk about boycott, divest, and sanction with regards to Israel, it is laughable, it is comical. But to think of that as being our weapon, perhaps the only weapon that we have against Russia, unfortunately, it may be inevitable. The alternative is simply to throw up our hands and say, we've lost. Right? Goodness, democracy, all of this, we're not prepared to actually sacrifice a small quality of life in order to ensure it. Yes, it may cause run on gasoline prices and oil prices and heating gas prices, and that is terrible, and absolutely we should work to help mitigate the pain for those who suffer most from that. But are you honestly telling me you would rather pay under $4 a gallon to pump up the gas in your car? If that means that 40 million Ukrainians become slave to a dictator? Is that really the choice that you are making? We don't want to calm the economy because it's just getting going after COVID. That is your decision. Your job is more important than someone's life. Your job is more important than someone's freedom. It's so that you can absolutely understand why those Jews who tried to flee under Nazi occupation were turned away. Because the people who stood at the borders and shores of other countries felt exactly like that. And the ashes of Auschwitz tell that tale. There are wars that we are commanded to wage of self-defense, and I do not believe that at the moment the United States is under direct assault and attack. But there are things we can do short of war that will be every bit as powerful in response, in some ways more. When we act as a global world and say, no, We know where this path leads. We know what this leads to. We will not allow this to happen again. And we will defeat you in the only terms you understand, which is not power and might. That's the fight that people want to get into, but by humiliation and isolation. If you wish to act as a troglodyte, then go back to your cave. And if that makes life harder for us, while at the same time curbing you, so be it. And when you are ready to come out of your cave and behave as a reasonable, rational, peaceful country, we will welcome you. But in the meantime, this is not reshut. This is not optional. We must act and we must stand together because we know what it is like when the world is silent. Shabbat Shalom.